Well, thank you, Helen. That was an amazing presentation. Even though I've seen it before, I think you did yourself explaining a lot of technical information in a very concise and straightforward manner. And I know we had a lot of good questions on the science. And so this is the first of 3 sessions that we were anticipating having. The second session would be devoted to just the science, to hear more about the USGS models from the modelers themselves that developed them for us. In addition to that, the background studies that went into the information that Helen had in that schematic that showed the 2 different models and the different components that went into that. So our second session would be all about that, delving much greater in details into that. We had a question about the model evaluation group and their review and what data is available publicly from their input into their critique of the model and how it predicts for the TMDL and for the total nitrogen target that we have proposed here to you today. So that would be the second session. So those of you that are interested really to, rolling up your sleeves and digging into the science, we'll have a 2 or so hour session on that. Has not been scheduled yet. It will be sometime in the new year, but that's just a preview of where we're going with this. And then our third session would be all about implementation. And I know that we are already receiving questions. Why is it 80% and not 60% for my municipality when we could achieve that to meet the target number? Well, we'll delve into that a lot more in an implementation session, and we'll talk about what that entails and what the municipalities would do. But for the next session, we have built on, now that we're talking about the Barnegat Bay TMDL, we wanted to also lay out various ongoing initiatives that are already having happened in the Bay. Lynette talked about the 10-point plan, and she pointed out several times where there was Section 319 non-point source funding that led to particular projects. And so our third session would be a lot more about implementation. So today we have a few speakers that are talking about current ongoing projects in Barnegat Bay. And those projects will be part of a TMDL implementation plan that is already working towards achieving that 20% and 80% reduction. So I wanted to pick up where Helen had started to talk about what is the TMDL and an overview of the program, and then really focus on the TMDL implementation plan. So real quickly, I'll reiterate what is the TMDL process, components of a TMDL report, and more about the TMDL implementation. We said this before, TMDLs are required under Section 303D of the Clean Water Act to be developed for water bodies that cannot meet surface water quality standards after the implementation of technology-based effluent limitations. That's a mouthful. We've talked about we're establishing site-specific criteria in the watershed, and in order to attain that target number, we'll have an 80% reduction required and a 20% reduction requirement. And TMDLs are required under our New Jersey Water Quality Management Planning rules for water quality limited waters. That is the 303D list that Helen was talking about. And then our rules also talk about a requirement to have a TMDL implementation plan, which includes the strategies designed to achieve attainment of the surface water quality standards. So the federal rules do not have this requirement. EPA in their guidance asks that states include an implementation plan, but our regulations actually require it. A TMDL, again, represents the assimilative or the loading capacity of the receiving water. It takes into consideration point sources, non-point sources, background conditions, and surface water withdrawals. Helen talked about what that entails, and that would reiterate that the load allocation is the non-point sources. So as we do not have major point source dischargers in Barnegat Bay, this TMDL is all about the loading reductions from non-point sources. And Helen talked about simple versus complex models, and simple mass balance models are those spreadsheet calculations. But as you could tell from Helen's presentation, this clearly was a dynamic water quality model. So this is what we call a complex model to develop our TMDL. Back in 2002, EPA issued guidance on what states have to submit to EPA as far as components of a TMDL document. It starts with the source assessment, characterizing and quantifying as necessary the loading and the parameters in the watershed. You have to talk about your point sources and non-point sources and any background. You do your water quality analysis. That was the portion that Helen presented here today. That will be written up and put into our TMDL report. It will show the basic calculations that were done to achieve our target number. Then additionally, there's a reasonable assurance component, which I'll talk more about in a moment. Follow-up monitoring, which you'll hear about from Bob Schuster, our ongoing initiative, implementation, and continued public participation. So those are all the components of a TMDL report. And as asked previously, all the source documentation that goes into developing the TMDL will be identified in our reference section. There'll be appendices to our TMDL report, and all the information is made publicly available. It exists in many places, in various places at the time, but we pull it all together into one location for the TMDL report, and it would live on our department's website as well. So just to be clear, through the TMDL, we're proposing this nitrogen water quality standard. So after the TMDL model is set up, the target standard is used for the scenario development. Reductions are determined at critical locations in the watershed that are needed to achieve the water quality target. The New Jersey surface water quality standards allow, through the TMDL process, to determine a site-specific criteria to be applicable to a particular watershed. And as Helen said, we did not have a standard for these water bodies for nitrogen. And so the TMDL is establishing a site-specific standard for the Barnegat Bay Huck 14s. And through the TMDL process, we are creating a surface water quality standard unique to Barnegat Bay. The TMDL with the water quality standard are subject to formal public comment when we propose it in the New Jersey Register. As part of that process, we propose the TMDL as an amendment to a water quality management plan. In this case, it would be the Ocean County Water Quality Management Plan. Again, it goes in the New Jersey Register. It's subject to public comment. We do a response to comment document. We then submit it to EPA for formal approval. EPA reviews and has been reviewing our work along the way. And then it is adopted after EPA approves it as an amendment to the specific water quality management plan. And as I had said, we have an implementation plan component within that TMDL document. So the department, once the TMDL adopted, when it issues permits, they need to be consistent with the language in the TMDL. This it usually transpires when you're talking about an NJDEP's permit and point sources, and you have a target reduction required. But in this case, since we're talking about non-point sources, we also will talk about our stormwater permits through the municipal stormwater program. So that will be included in the TMDL implementation plan. And again, our third session where we talk only about implementation, we'll go into much greater detail of what that would look like. So any questions that you have in advance of that, we would want to know so that we're prepared to answer and have presentations to that. Again, that will take place in the new year. Our TMDLs in the implementation also talk about other measures that could be appropriate. So is there additional ordinances, or is there additional things that should happen in the unique to Barnegat Bay watershed to attain the reductions required to meet the total nitrogen number? And then we also talk about ongoing projects, which you'll hear some of after my presentation, and other initiatives that and projects and best management practices that will also get us towards the 20% and the 80% reductions. And then we would talk about Section 319H funding and other funding to implement TMDLs. A unique thing to our water quality management planning rules is that it has this requirement that all projects and activities affecting water quality in any planning area shall be developed and conducted in a manner consistent with that area-wide plan, and that the commissioner shall not grant any permits which conflict with an adopted area-wide water quality management plan. So again, the TMDL is proposed and then adopted to the Ocean County Water Quality Management Plan. This is the pie chart that you saw that USGS prepared, and Helen had that in her presentation. So the key takeaway for me from this slide as well is that regulated stormwater and non-point sources are important to reduce. You saw that the surface waters are contributing 38% reduction, and then the inlets an additional 29%. These are our targets of where best management practices, education outreach initiatives can happen to get us towards those reductions. And as I said previously, we would do that through the MS4 permit. We pointed out that we already have a statewide fertilizer law that is also getting us towards reductions. We have existing stewardship projects. And then we heard about the water bank, the loans, the monies that the millions of dollars that have been made available in the past 10 plus years in Barnegat Bay. So the TMDL has this requirement for reasonable assurance. So the TMDL should provide reasonable assurance that the regulatory and voluntary mechanisms will be applied so that the pollution reduction levels specified in the TMDL are achieved and the standard is attained. So that's a section in our document where we talk about all these ongoing initiatives and future initiatives that will get us towards meeting these requirements. And again, this is a reiteration of existing things. And the takeaway for you is while that 80% may sound like an enormous reduction, there's many things ongoing in the watershed that are already getting us towards that 80%. It's not a one-for-one. We're not saying this BMP in this township has to be 80% getting us towards the total nitrogen target. It's the accumulation of all the things in place, the regulations, the stormwater permits, the voluntary measures, the education outreach activities, and then you'll hear from other speakers on watershed protection plans, watershed restoration plans, and how those projects in very specific watersheds are drilling down to where the sources of the nutrients are coming from and are doing site-specific source control measures and projects. That's what will get us towards the reductions that are required. Are there any questions? Okay. Our next few speakers, you will hear about some of these stormwater and outreach initiatives. Again, as I said, these will be incorporated into our TMDL implementation plan. And then next up, we have Bob Schuster, and Bob will be talking about the ongoing monitoring in Barnegat Bay. So again, this is part of our reasonable assurance. Crystal, we have a question?
Yes, we had a couple questions come in. So there's one from George Murniak who says, has anyone calculated an estimate of total cost to date, NJDEP and EPA, on Barnegat Bay environmental improvement programs?
We have not done that analysis, but we certainly have the information to put some of that together.
Okay. And then one more question from Kim Kramer. Are the regulated permitted MS4s permitted under the CWA or New Jersey?
It's a federal requirement, but under New Jersey's laws, so they're permitted from New Jersey DEP.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And again, that will be in much greater detail in follow-up sessions. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Bob, and we'll hear more about the monitoring. And then we'll be followed by Rob Kroll from BRIC MUA, who'll talk about the Matitaconk Watershed Restoration and Protection Plan and various implementation projects. And Dr. Stan Hales will then talk about the Toms River Watershed Plan goals and objectives.